On paper, Austria is on the right side of history in Russia's war against Ukraine. It supports the sanctions against the Kremlin and sends both humanitarian and financial aid to Kyiv. And yet, Russian gas continues to flow to Austria, and Russian diplomats are still very much welcome there. So is Austria the real Trojan horse in Europe? Good evening, my name is Mateusz Mazzini, and this is Wider View. When Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer flew to Moscow in April of 2022 with a peace mission, many in Europe still believed they could reason with Vladimir Putin. Now, 2.5 years into the full-scale invasion, that's a view held only by fringe parties, at least in established democracies. But while Austria supports the political isolation of Russia, it still sees Moscow as a partner when it comes to finance. For over 2 years, Austrian financial institutions have continued to provide services in Russia. Vienna also refused to stop Russian diplomats at its borders, even the high-ranking ones. Now, as Austria heads into parliamentary elections this Sunday, it runs the risk of getting even closer to Moscow. With the far-right Austrian Freedom Party projected to win the vote, we dig deep into the real state of Austria-Russia relations in our first report.
Raiffeisen Bank International is Austria's largest financial institution. It provides services to clients in 27 different countries. 2 years into the full-scale invasion, that list still includes the Russian Federation. The bank has found itself under criticism for servicing nearly every Western company that still operates in Russia. Despite demands from international bodies, outgoing money transfers in Western currencies were still possible as recently as this summer. Only when the US threatened to cut it off from dollar trading did Raiffeisen shut them down. Similarly, pressure from the European central banks led to the suspension of euro transfers out of Russia last August. But Raiffeisen is still doing business there, with millions of euros in assets that it's unable to recover. Banking isn't the only sector where ties between Russia and Austria remain strong. Overall, according to the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute, as many as 56% of Austrian companies have yet to leave Russia. It is a staggering number, given that the global average is only 25%. On top of that, Russia continues to be the second largest foreign investor in Austria after Germany. Imports of Russian fossil fuels are also surprisingly high. Last December, gas from Russia accounted for 98% of all gas consumption in Austria. Construction, food and drinks, transportation and car manufacturing are among other parts of the economy where the partnership continues. Theoretically, no major sanctions are violated in the process. But from a political standpoint, it's clear that Austria hasn't distanced itself from Russia as much as it claims.
Is Vienna really the Russian agent of influence in Europe? How does this relate to its official position of neutrality? And lastly, will the Sunday parliamentary election change that position anyhow? Tonight, we're examining the case study of Austrian politics, together with an esteemed panel of experts. Joining me tonight are Professor Heinz Gartner from the Department of Political Science, University of Vienna, Professor Markus Wagner, Department of Government, but also University of Vienna, and Dr. Melanie Sally, Britain-born but Vienna-based political scientist. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
And Markus, I want to jump straight with you and ask you to give us the latest. We know that on Sunday, Austrians will head to the polls to elect their new parliament and government. Opinion polls, aggregated opinion polls, show a lead of the far-right Freedom Party, but that's a marginal lead nonetheless. So what's the situation like right now? Is the far-right actually still projected to win or will be maybe a knife-edge election this Sunday?
So currently the polls are showing that the radical right, the Freedom Party, is still ahead at about 27% of the vote. But the polls are narrowing, so things are getting a bit closer, and the center-right party, the People's Party, which is currently in government, is closing in on the Freedom Party. So it's now sort of 27% for the Freedom Party, 25% for the People's Party. And the People's Party has been sort of catching up recently, and so there could be a surprise on Sunday. People aren't as certain as they were a few weeks ago that the Freedom Party will place first, and so there's a bit more excitement now than there was. So those are the two biggest parties: the Freedom Party and the People's Party. So the radical right and the center-right party. The other parties are the Social Democrats, which are sort of at 21%, 20% in the polls. They might also do a bit better than that. There seems to be a sort of a slight trend there, but they're not doing as strong as they hoped. And then there's a few smaller parties, the Greens, the Liberals, that might be relevant for government formation, but won't be anywhere near the top of the leaderboard. So really now it's narrowing between the Freedom Party and the People's Party, and it will really be important for which government is formed after the election, which of those two parties comes out first.
So on that note, I actually want to follow up with you, Melanie, and ask you about the reaction of other parties to this sudden ballooning of support of the Freedom Party. How are other formations actually approaching the lead in the polls of the Freedom Party? And especially I'm interested whether there is any risk of the Christian Democrats, the People's Party, co-opting at least partially the message of the far right.
Well, I think they've already done that on some issues like migration. They're trying to make sure that they are a home for the potential voters of the radical right Freedom Party. I think the other parties are very worried about this rise of the far right. For above all, it's the Austrian image abroad because of the historical background, of course, which could be very negative. And there's a general dislike of the party leader in particular. So Herbert Kickl is the leader of the Freedom Party. The People's Party seems to hedge around a little bit in a fudge and says, well, we won't have any coalition with a Kickl party. But that leaves a lot of other options open if there were some other leader to emerge or to take over that kind of role in a coalition. The Social Democrats have been much more open and have said your Freedom Party is really very dangerous and rules out any cooperation with them. And so the other parties are also very skeptical of any cooperation with the Freedom Party. We know from state elections that this no from the People's Party to a potential coalition with the far right after the election can look very different. And I think a lot of voters know this and they feel, yeah, that we'll take this no as a bit of with a bit of a pinch of salt.
So we're going to talk about the reasons why the Freedom Party is polling so well, especially recently, in a second. But now I want to turn to you, Heinz, and ask about the foreign policy / international aspect of this election, because we know the Freedom Party to be openly pro-Russian, consistently voting against or speaking up against sanctions on Russia. We know Herbert Kickl being a staunch supporter of the peace process with Ukraine to be started as soon as possible, no matter the losses on behalf of Ukraine. So how central, how important is the Russian question for this election and for the Freedom Party in particular?
First of all, I have to underline that Austria is firmly anchored in the European Union. So it also takes part in the European security and defense policy, and even the Freedom Party will not leave the European Union, even if they're in government. We already have some experience, and the Freedom Party already was in government several times in Austria. They are critical on certain aspects, and they are not as pro-Russian as we might think. Of course, they are using some arguments that sanctions do not work and do not end the war. So that might be a rational argument which is abused or used by the Freedom Party, but that does not make them entirely pro-Russian. So if the Freedom Party comes to government, I don't see that much of a change of the Austrian foreign policy. After all parties, maybe except of the neos, the small neos, support neutrality. That's not only the Freedom Party, all the other parties as well. And the Austrian population with 80% support neutrality as well. So there is not that much of a change. There might be more change when it comes to domestic policy, especially when it comes to the migration and asylum issue.
I would actually like to dig a little deeper into what you just mentioned, because you said around 80% of the Austrian population supports the position of neutrality. Is this something that the Freedom Party is actually trying to weaponize to gain political capital and support by saying, listen, we've always been neutral since 1955, we've got neutrality enshrined in our constitution, we should stay away from any military conflict? And after all, we have Herbert Kickl being a co-founder of the Patriots for Europe together with Viktor Orban. We know Viktor Orban's position on the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think neutrality is something that the Freedom Party is using to their own advantage?
No, of course, they're a populist party and they're using what the population wants to see. But if the wrong people say right things, doesn't mean that the right things are wrong. So neutrality is not necessarily wrong because Freedom Party supports it as well as other parties. And after all, there are different aspects of neutrality. And the Freedom Party supports an isolationism and neutrality, so keeping out of everything. The other parties, especially the Social Democrats, they are more for an active and engaged neutrality. That means raising the voice when it comes to war, to human rights violation, to genocide. So that's not staying out and keeping out of conflicts, that's raising the voice, but it's staying out of military alliances. That's the most important thing.
That actually works very well as a build-up for the second part of our discussion. So thank you very much for the analysis of the current state of the relations between Austria and Russia and the projections for the Sunday vote. Now let's spend some time on looking at the past and the future to see the roots of Austria's neutral position and perspectives for change. Austria has formally been a neutral country since 1955. Neutrality was one of the main conditions for its regained sovereignty after World War II. Since then, Vienna has become pretty much synonymous with multilateralism, hosting numerous international institutions. Neutrality became so deeply rooted in the Austrian national identity that many cannot even imagine it being dropped. Where has this led Austrian politics? We look for answers in our next report.
Neutral. They could not afford a strong democratic state in the heart of Europe, fully embedded in Western institutions. Neutrality was written into the Austrian federal constitution and continues to be the driving principle of its foreign policy. As a result, Austria only joined the European Union in 1995. The same year saw it entering the Partnership for Peace and NATO-affiliated program. But it never applied for permanent and full-fledged membership in the alliance. Instead, it prides itself on being a hub for multilateral diplomacy. Vienna is home to some 50 international organizations and is one of the 4 principal headquarters of the UN. Over 13,000 international staffers, most of them diplomats, live and work in Austria's capital. Among them are at least 180 Russian citizens. Austria did not expel them after the invasion of Ukraine. Despite international criticism, it also continues to allow entry to Kremlin officials. The leaders of the Freedom Party of Austria see this as the right approach. The far-right group, led by Herbert Kickl, is currently polling at 28%. It is projected to win the parliamentary vote on September 29th, but might struggle to find a coalition partner. A close ally of Viktor Orban, it advocates for a ceasefire and peace negotiations in Ukraine. Should it take over power, Austria's relations with Russia would grow even closer than now.
Marcus, I want to begin the second part of our discussion with you and ask you about the roots of this recent rise in polls of the Freedom Party. Because from the outset, at least the way we look at it here in Warsaw, Austria doesn't seem to be suffering from all of the traditional problems that fuel far-right populist parties in other parts of Europe, being it migration, high unemployment, security issues in domestic perspective. So where does the staunch support for Herbert Kickl and his acolyte actually come from in this particular case?
Yeah, so I mean, the FPÖ, the Freedom Party, is a really established party in Austria. It's been around for many decades, but the current situation, the current political situation really benefits it. So on the one hand, even though Austria is a very rich country, currently the economy isn't doing that well. So people are still upset about the high levels of inflation. They're upset about the low levels of growth. So there's sort of a negative general mood in the country, and that sort of benefits the opposition parties, in this case, the Freedom Party, as in many other countries. And also in general, the topics have been beneficial for the Freedom Party. So focus on migration issues. So Austria does have very high levels of migration, and in the population, there's sort of a concern about these high levels of migration mixed with a concern, justified or not, with levels of crime.
Let me interrupt you for a second, because I would really like to make a clear comparison between Germany, which is this one case that stands out in European politics about issues of migration and also lack of the capacity to properly assimilate migrants into society. Is this really a similar problem in Austria, or is this at least perceived as such?
Yeah, I mean, Vienna is still one of the most livable cities in the world, and in general, I think the integration of foreigners and migrants in Austria works well. But I think there's a perception in the population that things aren't going as well as they should, or that a certain limit has been reached. So there's sort of certain unwillingness to accept more migration, or a certain unhappiness with the levels of migration that exist at the moment. And this is one source of dissatisfaction that also leads to the rise of the Freedom Party.
So, Melanie, kind of straightforward question to you, I think, at least. Neutrality, as we've heard previously, was established as the doctrine of Austrian foreign policy in 1955. It's enshrined in the constitution. But the word has changed quite drastically since the Cold War, and we have an actual real war in Europe right now. What would have to happen for Austria, in your opinion, to abandon the position of neutrality?
Well, I don't think it will in any time soon, because it's a bit of a holy cow. Nobody talks really about neutrality because it's so popular. As you said, in 1955, it's associated with peace, prosperity, stability, all those good things in the past. And why would you want to give that up? And for 10 years before that, Austria was under four-power occupation, and the eastern part under Soviet Union. And I think people look and say, well, you shouldn't really poke the Russian bear in the backside. He could turn around and bite you. So there's a little feeling of caution when it comes to that. And there's, I think, a resentment against NATO, or a certain anti-American influence in some of the population. So generally, they like to feel that they're a bridge builder between East and West. Vienna is further east than Prague. It's a kind of East-West mix, really. And so the parties as well, stay off the subject of neutrality.
Is this where the Russian relationship kind of plays into? Because in preparation to this show, we discovered a very interesting fact that actually the very first contract for the exportation of Soviet, back then, gas into Austria was already signed in June of 1968. So that clearly establishes that the perception of the Soviet Union, be it Russia right now, is as a partner that you could trade with, is very deeply rooted in the Austrian politics. Is that really still the case?
Well, I think it is, especially, of course, in the older generation. But also there is an economic factor, and that is how much you're going to pay for gas. And if you say, well, cut off Russian gas, energy prices go up. as a result. People aren't going to be very happy about that when they're already feeling the pinch in their pockets and they don't feel they're getting paid enough, etc. So if you offer them an alternative, which could be just as attractive in terms of price, then that might help. But I think you have to understand the plight of people who are reliant on gas. It takes a long time to just switch off, gas and Russian gas and go to something else. But I think this process is underway, and there's a lot of effort being made for it. And of course, the Freedom Party does then exploit these divisions and say, well, you could be paying a lot more for gas if you're going to abandon, the Russian side.
So, Heinz, let's bring you into this part of the discussion and ask about international institutions, because you've mentioned yourself the doctrine of Austrian neutrality forbids the country from joining military alliances. But we have seen not so long ago two other countries formerly neutral, Sweden and Finland, actually two countries that joined the European Union together with Austria in 1995, abandoning their position, joining NATO. Is there a path ever that you could foresee for Austria to become a fully fledged permanent member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization?
I have a little different perspective here. First of all, I do not think it is all the economic relations related to a neutrality. And after all, the Austrians were very happy when they got the state treaty and the neutrality that the Soviets would leave. That was one of the major successes of Austrian neutrality. And we should not forget President Eisenhower supported very much Austrian neutrality, and the Soviets hesitated for a while because they feared that Austria would join NATO together with Germany. So only after Germany joined NATO, the Soviets accepted Austrian neutrality. And later on, of course, neutrality served Austria well during the Cold War. So there is some analogy to Finland. Finland is now in a situation in which Austria, and Finland was it already during the Cold War as well, but it was during the Cold War, and Austria's neutrality worked well for Austria in this divided world. And now we are moving again towards a polarization and divided world, especially when it comes to Ukraine. So I don't see why Austria should abandon neutrality, which was so successful in times of the Cold War and also in peace times. So I don't understand the Finns why they joined NATO in this situation, but it's up to the Finns.
So a very quick question. Is there anybody on the political scene in Austria right now who actually floats the idea of becoming a member of NATO and abandoning neutrality?
Yeah, we do have the NEOS, which is a small party, and they are more or less supporting NATO membership, even so they do not really openly express it that way and say that we should join a European defense unit, a European army, and together with the European army joining NATO. But having said this, I do think there are discrete Atlanticists in all parties. So that's not full-fledged argument here that some parties are for NATO and others against. Of course, there are divisions within the parties.
Absolutely. We will definitely be keeping an eye on what's going to happen in Austria on Sunday. Professor Heinz Gärtner, Professor Markus Wagner, Dr. Melanie Sully, thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Austria isn't the only country in Europe where the pro-Russian far-right is gaining support. No matter the result of the Sunday vote, its companies will still trade with Moscow, probably out of fear of losing their assets, among other reasons. But fear is not much of an excuse when Russian bombs continue to fall on Ukrainian cities, thanks in part to Austrian banks and industrial giants. Thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, we will take a closer look at the state of European security as Warsaw hosts the Warsaw Security Forum. Make sure you're with us next Thursday and have a good evening.